Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about natural selection, which is a way that evolution can occur. So natural selection and evolution are related, but they're not the same thing. Evolution is just a change in a population over time. If you want to think of it in terms of genetics, it's a change in the allele frequency. That's how common a particular allele is in a population, which can also be called a gene pool, over time. So if you think about it like this, it's the number of alleles for a particular trait divided by the total number of alleles in a population. So natural selection just says that some environmental selecting agent is going to choose the individuals who are best suited for that environment to survive and reproduce. If they survive and reproduce, they're going to change the population over time. So the individual doesn't change, the population changes. So the number of individuals that have a particular phenotype will change over time. Now, this is just one way that this change can occur. It's not the only way that evolution happens, but it's the one we're going to talk about today. Some of the other ways that evolution can occur is through mutation. Things like migration, like moving into or leaving a population, genetic drift, which is kind of a random occurrence, and we'll talk more about these later on. But again, we're just going to focus on natural selection for today. So we can't talk natural selection without bringing in Charles Darwin. So he developed this theory of evolution by natural selection based on his observation. So he was a naturalist. He was observing his surroundings and looking at species and thinking about why it was that they seemed to be similar, but then you had these differences. And so you had these similarities between species, but you also had these differences, and these differences seem to make them better suited for particular environments. And there's some basic ideas involved in this theory that we're going to discuss. So there's this idea of overproduction, variation, competition to survive, adaptation, differential reproductive success, and then the idea that all of these come together to cause evolution of a population. So let's imagine that you're a moth and you live in an area that has lots of trees, and the trees all look like this. Now, if there's two versions of moth, light and dark colored, which ones are going to be more common, do you think, in this environment? So if most of the trees are light, you would expect most of the moths to also be light. Some of the darker colored ones might survive, but they'd likely be eaten more frequently than the light colored ones. Now, if the environment changed for some reason and the trees became darker, well, you would expect that in that circumstance, the darker colored moths would become more frequent in the population. And this is exactly what we see. And that really is the idea behind evolution by natural selection. So the environment selects the individuals that are best suited to survive. And if you survive, you make babies, and those babies make babies. And over time, you see a shift in the frequency of a particular trait over time. So let's stick with our moth example to go through these different concepts. So this idea of overproduction of offspring states that organisms tend to make more babies or produce more offspring than the environment can support. So if this is your moth and all of those little circles are eggs, you can imagine that the environment couldn't support all of those offspring surviving. There's also variation in offspring. So some offspring are born one trait, say phenotype of lighter coloration, while others are born with darker. And this is all because of different allele combinations, right? Now, those differences can be the result of mutations, crossing over, independent assortment, random fertilization. All of those are going to contribute to this variation in the population. And in terms of evolution, variation is good because the environment is always changing. Okay, so you make a lot of babies. They're all a little bit different. They have variation. Then there's going to be some sort of competition to survive, right? There's some supply in the environment that's limited. You can think of food might be limited, shelter, mates, water, maybe not getting food, but trying to avoid being food, sunlight. What organisms might compete over sunlight? If you said plants, you're right. So plants are also competing for resources. Oxygen, if you're in like an aquatic environment, that's going to be something that may become limiting. Okay, so you've got lots of offspring being born. They're all a little bit different. And there's a selective pressure in the environment that's choosing individuals to survive. Well, some individuals that are born with the variations that help them to survive, we say they have an adaptation. So the variation itself is random. You can't choose to have a variation. But if that variation gives you an advantage, then we say it's an adaptation. And where these light-colored moths may have been doing really well in that light-colored forest, if for whatever reason the environment changed, now the dark-colored moths are the ones who have the variation that we would consider an adaptation. Now remember, you don't get to just choose which one. So if the environment changes, you can't just decide that you're going to change. Individuals cannot evolve, but populations over time, if there's variation, certain individuals will survive and pass that on. So now we come to kind of the crux of the argument. So you have lots of babies, they have a lot of variation, there's selective pressure in the environment, some of them are better suited. Well, for natural selection, it's all about who survives and leaves behind offspring. So if you survive, the assumption is you're going to produce offspring, and if you can pass that trait on to your offspring, it's going to increase in the population. Survival of the fittest doesn't necessarily mean survival of the strongest. It just means that those individuals who survive and pass their traits on will have those traits accumulate in subsequent generations. And as a result, your population will change over time. And when you look at different species, they seem like they're really just well suited to their environment. Well, it's because the individuals that were born that didn't have traits that were suited died and didn't leave behind any offspring. And so those traits disappear and other traits will accumulate. Now, one could imagine that if there's different environments selecting individuals, you could actually have this accumulation of different traits until they become different species. And that's something called speciation, and we'll talk about that. So you can imagine that the cats all have this common ancestor that was not a lion or a cheetah or a panther. But that common ancestor found, in different environments with different selective factors, you have this accumulation of different traits over time, and now you have different species. Again, we'll talk more about that later on. All right, another example that might help you kind of internalize this idea of evolution by natural selection. I like to consider the zombie apocalypse. So let's say the zombies come. There's some sort of virus and bacteria, something in the environment. It's turning everybody into zombies. Well, some of us have a gene that makes us resistant to becoming a zombie. Now, nobody knows who it is because there's no way to tell until the zombie apocalypse comes. Well, those of us who are resistant will survive. The rest of you, sorry. Over time, you would imagine that the population would change, and eventually we wouldn't have to worry about the zombies because we would all be resistant, because the only people who survived and reproduced would have that gene. We see the same scenario play out with bacteria. Now, antibiotics work really well at killing bacteria. Different antibiotics act on different types of bacteria, but generally they're going to try to kill something in a bacterial cell that's not present in, say, a eukaryotic cell, like me or you. Well, most bacteria are susceptible or can be killed by an antibiotic. But sometimes there's a mutant bacteria. They have some sort of mutation. It was random. They didn't know they had it until zombie apocalypse antibiotic is applied. And so those individuals who have that mutation are going to survive and leave behind offspring that also have that resistance. Bacteria reproduce asexually, and so all of their offspring will have the gene for resistance. This can be a real issue if you take your antibiotics incorrectly. So like you start feeling better after day 3 and you decide you're just not going to take any more antibiotics. It can be a huge issue because really what you're doing is selecting the most susceptible, so the bacteria that are most likely to be killed, to kill off, and leaving behind bacteria that are better able to resist antibiotics. Now, many antibiotics that we take, if you take your full dose, will work in killing the bacteria that you're targeting. But if you can imagine, you have a really diverse ecosystem of bacteria that live in and on you with different varying levels of susceptibility to antibiotics. So when you take an antibiotic, you're going to kill the most susceptible bacteria, leaving behind those that are more resistant. Those resistant bacteria reproduce, and then the next time you take that antibiotic, nothing happens because all of them have that resistance, which is why antibiotics are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. It's this kind of evolutionary arms race. Bacteria are also interesting in that they reproduce asexually, but they have mechanisms for sharing genes, so they can actually pass that on to other bacteria. Again, we'll talk more about this, but it's an interesting example of evolution by natural selection that we can observe in real time. Okay. Something I do want to mention is this idea of descent with modification. So everything alive today is descendant or descended from some other species that existed. So each generation, there's slight differences in offspring, and over time those accumulate, and you can see this formation of a new species. Horses are an interesting example in that the ancestral horse species was really kind of tiny, maybe the size of a cat, and it actually had toes. Whereas the horse that we see now, modern day horses, they basically have one middle finger toe that they balance on. This didn't happen right away, but there were different selective factors that contributed to this change over time. Now, be careful with this idea. That doesn't mean that one thing turns into another thing. Fish did not become salamander, that became cat, that became you. Just like you are not your father or your grandfather. You are descended from them. These cladograms or family trees that we see, these are another way of representing kind of passing traits down. And how closely related you are to someone. Now, again, that doesn't mean your parents become you. It just means that they pass on traits to you. These trees are there to show us that you are more closely related to your siblings than you are to your cousins because you share a recent common ancestor. Just like you are more closely related evolutionarily to a cat because you share a more recent common mammal ancestor than maybe you do to amphibians. Now, you also share an ancestor with amphibians. It's just further back in evolutionary time. You diverged further back. This kind of idea of your family tree in terms of cousins, second cousins, and siblings is kind of useful in visualizing that. Another kind of thing to remember is that we share common ancestors. So if we go back far enough, we all share a common ancestor, whether you're a bacteria, a plant, a fungus, a human, a slime mold. Somewhere at some point there was that first living thing, and we share that last universal common ancestor. And there's lots of evidence that supports this. If you think about it, we all use DNA. We all have cellular structures. There's things that were passed on, and then evolution causes all of this really amazing diversity. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. The task that I would like you to complete to kind of solidify this learning is to produce a cartoon. And don't worry, I will not be judging you on your artistic ability. You could use a real organism or a made-up organism. But what I'd like you to do is try to illustrate the following concepts with a picture. So overproduction and variation in offspring, some sort of limited resource, finite resource, competition for survival, and then showing how natural selection influences that reproduction. Here are some ideas. You might think about how did these traits evolve in that population? What selective agent was acting on that population to give you the results that you get? Here's one I put together really quickly. So you have a whole bunch of organisms born with different size necks, different length necks. There's lots of really yummy fruit, but it's up high in the trees. And so only the individuals that have longer necks can get the good food. So they survive, the other ones not so much. The survivors make babies, and all of those babies, have the long necks. And there's other variations that may also be selected upon. So you can imagine kind of different scenarios. So have some fun with it. That's kind of the end thing for today, and we will talk about this again next time.